Today on Uncommon Knowledge, Your Life or Your Rights, GORE VIDAL on the war on terrorism and civil liberties. Can we win the war on terrorism without sacrificing our rights? Last fall, after the September 11th terrorist attacks, Congress enacted and President Bush signed the so-called USA Patriot Act, legislation intended to thwart the threat of domestic terrorism. Critics denounce the legislation as a dangerous expansion of government power at the expense of our civil liberties. Are they correct? Joining us today, two guests who believe they are. Robert Higgs is a senior fellow at the Independent Institute and the author of Crisis and Leviathan. Gore Vidal has been an author, playwright, essayist, and commentator on the political scene for more than 50 years. His latest book, Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, How We Got to Be So Hated. What we face now is a dire threat to the American people and indeed to the Republic, but it's one not envisioned by the Constitution because it's not sponsored by a specific state. There's money coming from the Saudis, we should deal with them. There's money coming from a number of sources. What should he do?
Well, not what he is doing. It is a power grab. Perpetual war for perpetual peace has been American policy since, certainly since 1950. Thank you, Harry Truman.
Can I ask you, because you do write, I want to quote you again. 50 years ago, Harry Truman replaced the old republic with a national security state whose sole purpose is to wage perpetual wars, hot, cold, and tepid, close quote. All right, we've heard reservations about the revolution and from you about the Civil War, and yet you date the moment things went wrong, we lost the republic, from Harry Truman. How come? What was distinctive about the Cold War?
Well, we went back on the agreements that we had made with the Soviet Union, as it was called in those days, at Yalta, that Roosevelt had made with Stalin. Harry Truman then inherits the presidency. Roosevelt is dead. Harry Truman goes to Potsdam. While there, he receives a message that the atom bomb works.
Right.
This means he doesn't need Russia in the war against Japan, winding up that war. So he goes back on every agreement that had been made at Yalta between FDR and Stalin. He also, this is not generally known out there, now here's a little history lesson. We divided Germany, not Stalin. We pretend that Stalin did it because he was evil. And you know what evildoers are. They're relentless, they never sleep. So the division and the Cold War begins with the division of Germany. Stalin is scared to death of it. From that moment on, we've had perpetual war for perpetual peace. Now, we keep moving off the subject. You mind if I move back onto the subject?
You move in any direction you
All right,
like.
I'm going to move back to it. What should Bush have been done? What should Congress do? Well, I'll tell you exactly what they should do. This was the greatest blow that we have ever suffered, what happened on 9/11, as it's called. Nothing like that has ever happened since the British burned down the White House at the beginning of the 19th century. Where is Congress? Where was the FBI? Where was the CIA? When Pearl Harbor happened, the first thing they did was investigate FDR and why he allowed Pearl Harbor to happen, and they felt he had a hand in it, and he did have a hand in it. But it took years.
I'm sorry, you said it was about 2 weeks after the attack, FDR established a commission to investigate the intelligence failure. You're talking about something else?
Yes,
go ahead.
But that was his commission, not Congress.
All right.
Congress should have done it.
Right.
The executive, which had allowed this to happen, is the last person you want to have study.
But we have committees, there's one in the Senate and in the House now investigating the intelligence failure that led to September 11th.
Sure, yeah. Senator Danforth, a wonderful committee to find out what happened at Waco, for God's sake. $12 million Senator Danforth spent of public monies to find out whether Janet Reno had given the order to the FBI to murder civilians, the biggest slaughter of American civilians since Wounded Knee. Well, that was a total whitewash. Where was Congress? Where is Congress now? Bush asked Senator Daschle not to investigate what went wrong with the FBI and the CIA, that we had no warning that these crazies from Saudi Arabia, not from Afghanistan, were going to attack us. Silence.
So your point
and
is...
nobody seems curious.
Your point is not merely that Bush is being aggressive, grabbing power, but that Congress is supine.
Well, supine, who knows? I mean, you have to examine something. For all I know, they're being very active by being supine.
All right. Well, see, this is why I wanted to probe you a little bit on the Cold War, because essentially you view the Cold War as a series of mistakes by the United States. You don't view Stalin as an enemy or
no,
as...
he was sort of hopeless and helpless. He had...
East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956.
Oh, come on. These are border states that he quite rightly feared. You see, Americans are not taught any history of any kind, and what we do get is generally propaganda. Look at the high school history books. I mean, they make no sense at all.
So it was understandable
he had been
crushed
invaded.
those
Russia
revolts.
had been invaded about in 150 years, 3 or 4 times. They have a deserved nervousness about invasion, particularly from the West. He grabbed every border state that he could. He was not on the march. We pretended. I mean, NATO was our invention to control Western Europe.
I want to get off the Cold War and come to this war, but would that be your view as well, that the Cold War was all a great error on our part because Stalin really wasn't an enemy?
That's not my view. I think Stalin was a very menacing character.
To his own
so
people.
I don't view the Cold War as
Let me
the
try a new
invention
point.
of the United States. At the same time, I would say that the United States certainly made decisions during the Cold War that were not in the interest of the American people.
But you'd expect that of an engagement that lasted half a century through people blunder, make mistakes, right?
I don't view all of these decisions as blunders. I view many of these decisions as simply decisions that promoted the interests of the government at the expense of the people of the United States.
Let me try. Let's get back to this issue of the lasting impact of national crises upon our civil liberties. You write, quote, "Once alienated, an unalienable right is apt to be forever lost," close quote. However, I put it to you both, gentlemen, that there's a lot of evidence that it simply isn't so. Last couple of years of the 18th century, when Americans fear, perhaps unjustly, perhaps they were, well, I think they were mistaken then. They fear a French invasion. Adams passes the Alien and Sedition Acts. Jefferson comes in. They're repealed and forgotten about. Civil War. Lincoln suspends the writ of habeas corpus. He imprisons over 13,000 citizens without charging them, without bringing evidence against them. Civil War ends. Habeas corpus is reinstated. First World War.
But the old regime is never reinstated.
No. Well,
and from
things
that time
change.
forward, because there's no real threat of secession, the federal government is entrained to become the Leviathan that it eventually becomes in the 20th century.
Here, my point is this, that as regards civil liberties, the pattern is clear through our history. That is to say, under threat, when the nation perceives itself as under threat, I would say that in 1798, Adams is mistaken. The French aren't about to invade, but he thought they might. First World War, that wasn't a joke. Civil War wasn't a joke. Second World War...
First World War was a joke.
Was
we
a
ought
joke?
not to have been in it. No, we had no interest. We went against not only George Washington. I'm perfectly willing to go against Mr. Washington's advice. We went against John Quincy Adams, one of our greatest figures and our greatest diplomat. And he said the United States, we were asked to help the Greeks free themselves from the Turks. This is the 1820s. And I paraphrase, but Adams said the United States is not a paladin that goes forth to slay dragons. If we were, we could become mistress of the world, and in the process, we would lose our own soul. That, to me, is the American expression of our, if we were ever exceptional, it was in that.
We are the friends of liberty everywhere, but the guardians only of our own. I believe that was also John Quincy Adams. But yes, I'm not sure about it. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. All right. Quite why I'm helping you make your argument. I'm not altogether certain. But the pattern I assert...
You're a good American.
Thank you. The pattern I assert is one of threat, retraction of civil liberties because of the threat. And once the threat disappears, the civil liberties are once again
extended. That's not the pattern of the 20th century.
No,
from
and
World
it's
War I
invented
forward,
threats.
there have been legacies of every one of these episodes that
Robert,
reduced civil liberties from that time forward.
You talk about the federal government as a leviathan. There's no doubt the budget is bigger, regulation is greater, and so forth. But that's different from civil liberties.
It's not different. The federal government has undertaken, for example, conscription. The conscription that was undertaken during World War I was unique because it was not the conscription of soldiers to defend the United States. It was conscription of soldiers to be sent to a foreign war in which, as Gore Vidal said, the United States had no genuine national interest.
But nobody on the scene is talking about conscription today.
People are talking actively today about conscription.
Who?
There's
not a general. Rumsfeld has said that he doesn't want it. They want the volunteer force.
The press has had a number of people urging conscription. These people are stirring up propaganda for it. It's always brought up at times such as this.
But Bush, that aggressor, that power grabber, he's not saying a word about it. Rumsfeld isn't saying.
Well, he is
on the
a known
contrary.
draft dodger, for God's sake, as is Cheney. Imagine a president.